All right, well, today we're going to talk about trustworthiness and integrity related to qualitative research. There are a lot of debates within the research community about the terminology that should be used when evaluating the quality of qualitative research. So the big disputes are about whether the term validity and rigor are appropriate in the use of qualitative research. And my personal feeling is I would like to see different terms used for qualitative research than quantitative research. However, one way that we can maybe be more consistent is to use one language set. So those are the issues, and you will see terms used multiple ways in publications. So in this course, what we are doing is you are learning some of the basics of research so that you can adequately read studies and interpret what is meant by those reports. And so by understanding the controversy with the language, you won't be thrown off if you see the term validity and think, wait a minute, is this a quantitative study? Instead, you'll be aware that that term might be used in a qualitative study. So when you understand the language that you're reading in these, you can become a better consumer of research. Some of the terminology that's used are something called goodness. There's goodness of fit, truth, value, integrity, trustworthiness, validity, and rigor. These are all terms that a researcher will use to try to make their case for why their study is a quality study. So Lincoln and Guba, those are two authors that if you are knowledgeable of qualitative research at all, you are aware of these folks. I have one of their books. It's about a 4-inch thick book, and this is the gold standard for qualitative researchers. The key term that they use in their framework is trustworthiness, and I think this is really useful. And it is basically, if you remember our first day of class, we talked about what is true. Well, this trustworthiness concerns the truth value of qualitative data, its analysis, and its interpretation. So this is very parallel with other quantitative criteria for evaluating the value of a study or its truthfulness. And there's 4, sometimes 5 criteria because they added a 5th one. So you'll see either of these. And that includes credibility, dependability, confirmability, transferability, and authenticity. So we're going to cover all 5 of those here today, and I'll give you some examples from a research study, and you might begin to recognize evidence of this in articles that you read. So there are 2 parts of credibility, our first feature of studies, and that's carrying out the study in a way that enhances the believability of the findings. In order to demonstrate credibility, they talk about the confidence in the truth of the data and the interpretation of them. This is like the internal validity that we talked about in quantitative research, and it's the most important criteria for assessing quality and integrity of qualitative research, because if your data is not true, it really doesn't matter from there what your conclusions are, what your findings are. So this is the very first step, and it's about having credibility. So here's a research study, and this study I'm going to use it as an example throughout this lecture. The title of it is "It's Just Horrible." Remember that often in a qualitative research report, we'll use a phrase to indicate the major finding of the study. So in this case, it's just horrible. A qualitative study of patients and carers' experience of bowel dysfunction in multiple sclerosis. So in this abstract here, you can see there are some conclusions are written about bowel dysfunction and its impact on people's life living with MS. And also on the caregivers are there. They talk about how data was analyzed, and they talk about how they obtained that data, the method they used, they called exploratory qualitative methods. So we really don't know one of the four methods that we studied. We don't really see this as ethnographic. We don't really see this necessarily as grounded theory. It's not clear from the write-up what kind of method was specifically used. Because of the title, I tend to think that it's a phenomenological study, and because it talks about experiences, but it doesn't say lived experiences, so we don't really know from this brief look at this, but it may be in either that grounded theory or in the phenomenological area. So they talked about here the design, and they just call it explorative qualitative design with techniques, purposive sampling, which you understand now to mean they went after the phenomenon of interest. And so they would have talked to all people with multiple sclerosis or their carers. They did have a research question, and that question, what's it like to live with fecal incontinence or constipation and multiple sclerosis, and how does that impact the lives of people with multiple sclerosis and their family carers? One thing I want to note is this pwMS, because in qualitative research, just like in nursing, we try not to label people by the conditions that they have. In this case as well, we talk about people with that condition, rather just saying, oh, multiple sclerosis patients, or, in the case of diabetes, diabetics. So we talk about people with that condition, and that's very consistent with the philosophy of qualitative research. And then when we look here at the design, they looked at a thematic analysis with textual data, and they used verbatim quotes when they presented the findings. That's one method of showing credibility. And they're saying because it's exploratory, they did not use a phenomenological or ethnographic approach, but they took naturalistic research to reveal the meaning of experiences as decided by study participants. So just like we could see in the abstract, this further confirms it in the content here, that this is not a purely phenomenological or ethnographic study. They just call it explorative. Here's how they collected the data: the semi-structured face-to-face telephone interviews. So think about that, face-to-face or telephone, wondering how that might vary in the responses. And then they did that based on the participant preference. Every person was asked to tell me about the problems you have with your bowel, and carers were asked, what is it like to care for someone with MS who has bowel dysfunction? And they used topic guides so that one researcher interviewing wasn't going down a different line of questioning than the other. And then if they couldn't find any evidence in the research, that's what empirical evidence means, then they used their own clinical experience working with people who have multiple sclerosis to decide what to place on that interview. And look, they took 10 to 60 minutes. So this gives ideas about the quality of the work by clearly saying how they developed the question guide, how they did it, where they did it, when they did it, how long it took. All of this lends itself to increase the credibility of this report. Then they talked about how they used an analytical hierarchy to go from detailed data to analyzing areas of interest. So they're beginning to talk about their analytical process. And then what we do is we look at the conclusions that are made and relate those to the questions that were asked. In this case, they looked at concern, anxiety, and distress for the people that are having this bowel issue who live with MS symptoms, and they also may have mobility and urinary incontinence. So this condition has a negative impact on, and here's some outcomes: social well-being and quality of life for many with repercussions for carers and other family members. Now, this obviously is a conceptual outcome. They did not measure social well-being on a scale from 1 to 10 and get quality of life scales, which there are many. They could have done that along with it, and then we'd have a mixed method study, and they might have more quantitative data that supports their qualitative finding. So they could have done a mixed method study. They could have studied this as an ethnographic study by doing, they could have gone and lived with each family and made observations during their time living with families about bowel dysfunction. What if they lived with 7 different families for a week each and then made recordings about that? That might be an ethnographic approach to this. So this is just what this credibility looks like when you're reading a study. So this is always kept in the back of the mind of the reader. In addition, our second phase is dependability. That's the stability of data over time and over conditions. So this is how reliable are these findings. So usually what we do for this is talk about interviewing until data saturation is made. That is one kind of way of understanding if that's dependable. And then also finding out, did every person express the major themes, what's missing, what's not there. So right here, one of the things that they talk about across conditions, they talk about as in other illnesses or neurogenic conditions. So now they're looking at related conditions with bowel function is compromised, such as Parkinson's, spinal cord injury, stroke, and spina bifida. The stigmatization and difficulty due to attitudes towards stool as a taboo. So they, in their discussion, one of the ways that they demonstrate dependability is they talk about the stability of the data with other conditions. And here are those conditions. So that's one way they do this. The third area is confirmability. And that's the potential for congruence between 2 or more independent people about data accuracy, its relevance, or its meaning. So this is similar to objectivity. It's concerned with establishing that the data represent the information participants provided and that the interpretations of those data are not imagined by the inquirer. In this case of this study, what we saw is that there were guides developed and that multiple people were involved both in collecting the data and in analyzing it. And that increases the level of confirmability in the study. Here's some other reports and the results of the study. There were 6 key themes that emerged: the physical experience of bowel dysfunction, the psychological impact of bowel dysfunction, the social impact, the impact on relationships and family, self-management strategies, and interactions with health professionals. So these issues, they say, were similar for people with MS and carers unless specified. And then they use verbatim quotes and followed by the individual who and their study ID in the way they represent the data. And they do this in tables and in the text as well in this article. So by doing this, they increase the idea that this wasn't made up. I mean, because without collecting any data, you might think of these themes like, okay, well, it probably has a physical, a psychological, and a social impact of family. And, you could come up with these on your own without going through this process. So they are clearly connecting the data they collected, however, to each of these areas. And that's what makes it research. So here's an example: the psychological impact of bowel dysfunction. And it causes, and this would be the researcher's interpretation, causes embarrassment, shame, and humiliation. And here is the participant language. It's just horrible and it makes me cry even when they're cleaning me up. It's so awful to have, it looks like, I can't read that, to have come to this, okay, as well as frustrations and anger about time wasted on the toilet, anxiety, and low mood were commonly reported related to bowel dysfunction. Having chronic constipation lifestyle that was giving me created this depression. It affected my whole family. Even though participants tried to think positively, an undercurrent of anxiety related to bowel dysfunction remained. You try and say to yourself, no, it's all right. You know, where the loo is, you're going to be fine. But there's always the possibility, oh, I'm not sure feeling. The impact of MS on mobility also contributes to anxiety over the risk of incontinence. I really panic because I can't move fast. I can't run into the toilet the way anyone else can. I've got this walker and I'm like treacle getting from A to B. You can tell this was, I believe, done in England, this particular study, because a treacle, another word for treacle is in the US, we call that molasses. So finally, 5 is authenticity, the extent to which the researcher fairly and faithfully show a range of different realities and convey the feeling and tone of participants' life as they're lived. And so that authenticity was added to the framework. And I think you very much can hear the authenticity through the quotes that the author selected. And then transferability. This is the extent to which qualitative findings can be transferred to other settings or groups. And that has to do with the generalizability. There was some discussion then in the, that would relate as well to this earlier section where we talked about other people that these could have these same kinds of neurogenic conditions that could be influenced by the by this concept of concern about the bowel. A very important table in your book is table 17.1. This is the quality enhancement strategies in relation to the quality criteria. So we just went through those 5 criteria, and what you can see here is where you might find evidence of these different aspects. So if you were looking for authenticity, remember that we saw in the findings, like the vivid description, those quotes we saw, the evocative writing. And so if you're looking for transferability, they did that in field notes. They say saturation of data, documentation of quality enhancement efforts, and thick, vivid description. So we saw it actually in the conclusion where they discussed other similar conditions. Confirmability is generally done in the data analysis with the inter-rater reliability using several forms of data and then peer review. And then dependability is done throughout the study with some processes like triangulation, and member checking. Remember how in my study I took it back to the members to increase dependability of the study, and then all of these lend themselves to credibility here. And then I've broken each one down. I don't have them all the way across, but just so you can see these kinds of strategies that qualitative researchers use in order to increase those 5 characteristics that lend themselves to us trusting the truth claims of a qualitative study. So we had in this study, we had audio recording, verbatim transcription. I didn't see where they talked about saturation of data or member checking. So these 3 are very commonly used, as is persistent observation. When data is coded, they look back and have different people check and code and recode, and will get together. They will review with each other, debrief and decide and make decisions about the data. And then the way the findings are presented, how they try to enhance the quality of their findings. In addition, actually who did the research matters. and the credentials and experience. In this study, they were all people who worked with people who had multiple sclerosis. And reflexivity is often not reported, but except that people will briefly mention in the study that they, as a researcher, they kept notes, their own, it's like your own personal diary or journal that you keep throughout the study, and that increases this trustworthiness. All right, so you can take all these different steps to enhance the quality of the study that you're doing, and then you, as a consumer of research, assess that quality by looking for the steps and seeing what they did to strengthen the credibility, dependability, integrity, validity, and trustworthiness of a study. Talk about some of these strategies that we've talked about in the table there. Prolonged engagement. This means taking the time to understand the condition in depth. Remember, I said if they did it as an ethnographic study, they could have spent a week living with each person. Some of these folks they talked to for 10 minutes. So you might wonder, is that sufficient time to have an in-depth understanding? They didn't say how many minutes total of tape they had or something like that, which might be helpful. If most people talked about this issue for an hour, then they might be considered more of a prolonged engagement. And then persistent observation, intensively focusing on the meaning. Salience means the meaning of the data being gathered. So thinking about that meaning, and you could see in the way the reports were done in the study with the quotes that they observed that persistently and were thinking about the meaning behind each one of those quotes. And then recognizing, anytime we talk about reflexivity, that means your own reflection. Think of this as the researcher's reflection on how their ideas and how they themselves are influencing the data and its collection. Triangulation, we've talked about, is using multiple data sources. And in this case, they could have done a quality of life inventory. They could have included that. And this has to do with different sources of data. And investor triangulation isn't about data collection, but it involves the investigators, different kinds of investigators, and also different, just having multiple people involved in that. And so these are all different kinds of triangulation method. And actually, what I described earlier about the data was actually method triangulation. Data triangulation, I'm sorry, is different types. Remember when I talked about taking photos and getting data from that and then talking to people? All of this is data triangulation. And then theory triangulation isn't relevant to data collection, but that's where you might look at the same data through different already existing theories. Then the other thing that we think about in evaluating quality is like, what doesn't, who was it? Maybe some people cope well with this bowel and they really don't have a problem. What's unique about them? And so we always are wondering about, like, is there any evidence we have that doesn't support our conclusion? And we want to include that case and discuss what to do with that data. And then a negative case is one that, again, just doesn't fit a hypothesis that we might have. Peer review and debriefing sessions are very important, that the researcher review the data and continue to think about how they themselves influence it. And then again, encoding and analysis strategy is to take a scrutiny of the data and all the documents and how you made a decision from that to go to the next one, to go to the next one. So just recognize that each of these areas, so these are strategies in data and methods. These are strategies when you code and analyze it. And so there are qualitative strategies that are used to increase the trustworthiness of the data in qualitative research. So these strategies, you should be looking for them in qualitative research that you read, and the more the researcher demonstrates their method in that way, the more trustworthy the data. You've learned a lot of the terminology that is new to you, and the best way to learn new terms are to use use the terms themselves, and also by reading. So put in qualitative research study and a topic you're interested in, or a patient population you're interested in, and read a study about that, and you'll get some insight into the life of someone who lives with that condition, and it will strengthen your ability to understand these terms. And we've also had key people, key researchers as part of that. Okay, well, here I had a slide that got out of order. And so quality strategy related to the presentation of the data are that they gave those contextualized descriptions, which we saw in this study, and then also understanding how credible is the researcher. Well, thanks for stopping by and working through this with us today. I appreciate your time learning more about qualitative research.